March 19th, 1943. North Atlantic, 400 miles south of Iceland. The water temperature was 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Captain Lieutenant Klaus Hartmann sat in the control room of U-91, listening to a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Ping, ping, ping. The destroyer above them had acquired contact, and it wasn't letting go. Hartmann had been hunting convoys in these waters for 18 months. He'd sunk 7 merchant ships. He'd survived 4 depth charge attacks. He knew the patterns. The Allies would get a momentary contact, lose it, circle back, waste dozens of charges on empty water. But this was different. The pings were coming faster now, more confident. The destroyer's propellers were accelerating, the sound growing louder through the hull. The British knew exactly where U-91 was, and they were coming straight for them. "Take her to 200 meters, Hartmann ordered. His voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. The diving planes angled down. U-91 descended. The pings followed, still locked on, still tracking. Hartmann checked his watch. 40 seconds, since the first detection. In earlier patrols, by now the destroyer would have lost them in the thermal layers, would be searching blindly, dropping charges at random depths. Not anymore. Ping, ping, ping. The sound was getting louder, closer. The destroyer was right above them now. "All stop," Hartmann whispered. Silent running. Every man in the boat held his breath. The diesel engines were already off. The electric motors went silent. No one moved. 63 men, frozen in place, listening to death circling overhead. Ping, ping, ping. The destroyer passed directly over them. Then the sound everyone dreaded. The distinctive metallic clicks of depth charges being rolled off the stern racks. 15 seconds. That's how long it would take the charges to sink to their depth, Hartmann counted. 13, 14, 15. Like a sledgehammer. The entire boat lurched sideways. Light bulbs shattered. Cork insulation rained down from the ceiling. A young seaman vomited from the shockwave. Then the second charge. Closer. The hull groaned, a sound like the boat was screaming. Hartmann watched a hairline crack appear in a weld seam. Third charge, fourth, fifth. 6 explosions in rapid succession, each one closer than the last. The pattern was too precise, too deliberate. The British weren't guessing anymore. When the attack finally stopped, Hartmann's ears were ringing. Blood was running from his nose. Half his crew looked like they were in shock. But they were alive. For now. Damage report, Hartmann said quietly. "Pressure hull intact," his chief engineer reported. "But we're taking water in the aft torpedo room. Electrical systems are failing. Both periscopes are jammed." Hartmann nodded slowly. They could patch the leaks. They could work around the electrical damage. But the periscopes without periscopes, they couldn't navigate, couldn't identify targets, couldn't fight. Above them, the pings continued. The destroyer hadn't left. It was circling. Waiting. This is the story of how Allied sonar technology evolved from a barely functional novelty into a weapon so precise, so devastating, that it transformed German U-boats from hunters into prey, and how that transformation would kill 40,000 German submariners in the most claustrophobic, terrifying way imaginable. But to understand how sonar became a death sentence, you have to understand how ineffective it was at the start. In September of 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and Britain declared war, the Royal Navy's primary anti-submarine weapon was called ASDIC. The letters stood for Allied Submarine Detection Investigation Committee, a deliberately misleading name designed to hide the technology from German intelligence. ASDIC was primitive. A dome mounted under a destroyer's hull would send out sound pulses. If those pulses hit something solid, a submarine, a whale, a school of fish, a temperature gradient in the water, they'd bounce back. An operator wearing headphones would hear the return echo and try to calculate the target's range and bearing. Maximum effective range, 1,500 yards, maybe 2,000 in perfect conditions. The problem was that perfect conditions never existed in the North Atlantic. The ocean wasn't a swimming pool. It was a constantly changing environment with temperature layers, salinity variations, and weather patterns that bent sound waves in unpredictable ways. A U-boat commander who understood these factors could disappear completely. Dive below a thermal layer, a boundary where warm surface water met cold deep water, and the ASDIC beam would reflect off the layer instead of penetrating it. The U-boat would vanish from the destroyer's screens like it had never existed. British destroyer captains knew this. German U-boat captains knew this. The first 2 years of the war became a chess game, played with physics and probability. And Germany was winning. Between September 1939 and December 1941, German U-boats sank over 1,200 Allied merchant ships. The submarines operated in wolf packs, coordinating attacks on convoys, overwhelming escorts through sheer numbers. British countermeasures were inadequate. Depth charges had to be set manually before being dropped. By the time a destroyer captain estimated a U-boat's depth, set his charges, and dropped them, the submarine had already moved. The charges would explode harmlessly behind or beside their target. U-boat crews became confident. Experienced commanders developed reputations. Gunther Prien sank the battleship Royal Oak inside the supposedly impregnable Scapa Flow anchorage. Otto Kretschmer alone sank 44 Allied ships. These men were treated as heroes in Germany, featured in propaganda films, given medals by Hitler himself. But in the research laboratories at the British Admiralty's Scientific Division, a revolution was beginning. The man leading it was Professor Patrick Blackett, a physicist who'd won the Nobel Prize for his work on cosmic rays. Blackett wasn't a naval officer. He'd never served on a destroyer. He approached anti-submarine warfare the way he approached any scientific problem, by collecting data, analyzing patterns, and finding solutions through mathematics. Blackett assembled a team that included mathematicians, physicists, and engineers. They studied every depth charge attack, every ASDIC contact, every U-boat sinking. They interviewed destroyer captains. They analyzed German tactics. And they identified 3 critical problems. First, ASDIC range was too short. 1,500 yards gave U-boats too much room to maneuver. By the time a destroyer detected a submarine and closed to attack range, the U-boat had already changed course and depth. Second, ASDIC beams were too narrow. The sound pulse covered a cone only about 15 degrees wide. A U-boat captain could evade simply by turning hard when he heard the ping. By the time the destroyer operator swept his beam back to the target, the submarine was gone. Third, ASDIC couldn't track depth accurately. The return echo told you range and bearing, but estimating depth required guesswork based on echo strength. That guesswork was wrong at least half the time. Blackett's team set out to solve all 3 problems simultaneously. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the technology that changed naval warfare, hit the subscribe button. We're just getting started. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: captured German technology. In May of 1941, the Royal Navy captured U-110 intact after forcing it to the surface with depth charges. The submarine's crew had abandoned ship without properly scuttling it. British sailors boarded before it sank and recovered the Enigma coding, machine which gets all the historical attention, but they also recovered something equally valuable: the U-boat's hydrophone array. German submarines used passive hydrophones to listen for ships. These hydrophones were significantly more sensitive than anything the British had. More importantly, they were arranged in arrays that allowed operators to determine not just the direction of a sound, but its precise bearing using triangulation. British scientists reverse-engineered the hydrophone design and applied the same principles to active sonar. Instead of a single ASDIC transducer sending out one narrow beam, they designed arrays with multiple transducers that could send out wider beams and receive more detailed return information. The new Type 144 ASDIC, introduced in late 1941, had 3 major improvements. Maximum range increased from 1,500 yards to 3,500 yards, more than double. Beam width increased from 15 degrees to 45 degrees, making it much harder for submarines to slip out of detection. And most critically, the new arrays could measure the Doppler shift in return echoes. When a submarine was moving toward or away from the destroyer, the frequency of the return ping would shift slightly, just like the pitch of a train whistle changes as it passes you. By measuring that shift, operators could calculate not just where the submarine was, but which direction it was moving and how fast. For the first time, destroyers could track submarines with real accuracy, but 3,500 yards still wasn't enough. U-boats could still dive deep and slip away, so the scientists kept pushing. By early 1942, they developed the Type 145 ASDIC, maximum range, 4,500 yards, and by late 1942, the Type 147, 5,000 yards, nearly 3 miles, a U-boat that surfaced to recharge batteries could be detected before the crew even knew a destroyer was nearby. And once detected at that range, there was nowhere to hide. The physics made escape almost impossible. Sound travels through water at roughly 4,800 feet per second. A ping sent out from 5,000 yards would take about 6 seconds to reach a U-boat and 6 seconds to return, 12 seconds total. In 12 seconds, a submerged U-boat moving at maximum underwater speed about 7 knots could travel approximately 140 feet. The ASDIC operator could compensate for 140 feet of movement easily, and the new Doppler tracking meant he knew exactly which direction the submarine was moving. German U-boat commanders noticed the change immediately. By March of 1943, patrol reports were describing attacks that seemed impossible, destroyers that detected them from miles away, depth charges that exploded within 50 feet of the boat even after aggressive evasive maneuvers, attacks that lasted for hours, with the destroyer never losing contact. Klaus Hartmann, the commander of U-91, submitted a report after his March 19th attack. The British have developed a new detection device with range far exceeding previous capabilities. Evasive diving no longer guarantees safety. Recommend immediate reassessment of all operational procedures. The report was filed with dozens of others saying the same thing. German naval intelligence initially dismissed them. The scientists said 5,000 yards sonar range was impossible. The British couldn't have made that kind of leap forward, but the sinking statistics told a different story. Before we go further, let's talk about what it was actually like to be hunted by this new sonar. Imagine you're inside a steel tube, 200 feet underwater. The tube is about 20 feet wide and 200 feet long. 63 men are packed inside with you. The air is thick with the smell of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, mold, and the chemical smell of the carbon dioxide scrubbers that keep you from suffocating. You can't see anything except the dim red glow of emergency lights. The regular lights are off to save battery power. You're running silent, which means the electric motors are turned off. Without the motors, there's no ventilation. The temperature is either freezing or sweltering depending on whether you're in the North Atlantic or Mediterranean. Right now, you're in the North Atlantic. It's cold. You haven't seen daylight in 3 weeks. You haven't taken a real shower in a month. You sleep in a bunk the size of a coffin, if you're lucky enough to have a bunk. Junior crewmen sleep on the deck, on top of torpedo crates, anywhere they can find space. And then you hear it. That sound. Ping. It's not particularly loud, just a metallic click echoing through the hull. But every man on the boat knows what it means. Someone up there is looking for you, actively hunting you with sound waves that penetrate the water like X-rays. Ping. The sound is coming faster now. That means the destroyer has a contact. Could be you, could be a thermal reflection, could be a school of fish. But they're investigating. Your commander orders the boat deeper, 200 meters, 250. The pressure hull groans. You try not to think about the fact that the ocean is pressing in on you with hundreds of tons of force, held back by steel plates less than an inch thick. Ping, ping, ping. The interval between pings is decreasing. That means the destroyer is getting closer. Or rather, you're getting larger in their sonar picture. The pings are bouncing off your hull, returning to the destroyer, painting a clearer and clearer image with each pulse. Your commander orders all stop. The electric motors go silent. Now the only sounds are your own breathing and the creaking of the hull and that goddamn ping, 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 ping. You can hear the destroyer's propellers now, a rhythmic thud, 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 thud through the water. It's getting louder. They're right above you. And then, silence. No pings. Just the sound of the destroyer's engines changing pitch, slowing down. You know what's coming next. Everyone knows. The destroyer has positioned itself directly over you. The crew is rolling depth charges off the stern, setting them to explode at your depth. 15 seconds. That's how long you have. 15 seconds of pure, distilled terror. Your commander doesn't say anything. There's nothing to say. Everyone is holding on to something, bracing for the impact. 10 seconds. 9. 8. You try not to think about what happens if the pressure hull fails. The water pressure at 200 meters is over 300 pounds per square inch. If the hull cracks, the ocean will crush you before you can drown. 3, 2, 1. The explosion is beyond anything you can prepare for. It's not a sound. It's a physical force that picks up the entire boat and shakes it like a toy. Your teeth slam together, your spine compresses, the boat lurches sideways, and you're thrown against a bulkhead. Then another explosion, and another. A full pattern. 8 depth charges, each one containing 300 pounds of Torpex explosive. If any one of them explodes within 20 feet of your hull, you're dead. Within 50 feet, you're probably dead. Within 100 feet, the shock wave will damage systems you need to survive. The explosions stop. You're alive, somehow. But the pings start again. The destroyer didn't leave. It's still up there, still tracking you, preparing another attack. And this time you've used up your battery power, your compressed air, your luck. This was the reality for U-boat crews in 1943. Not a glorious battle, not a fair fight, just hours of being hunted by an enemy you couldn't see, couldn't fight, couldn't escape. The turning point came in May of 1943, the month German submariners would call Black May. At the start of May, there were 118 U-boats operating in the North Atlantic, the largest concentration of submarines Germany had ever deployed. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat force, believed this was the moment Germany would win the Battle of the Atlantic. With enough submarines hitting enough convoys, Britain would starve. The island nation depended entirely on merchant shipping for food, fuel, and raw materials. Cut the convoy routes, and Britain would be forced to negotiate peace. Dönitz was wrong. By the end of May, 41 U-boats had been sunk, 41, in a single month. The casualty rate was 35%. The numbers were devastating. But the psychological impact was even worse. German submariners were among the elite. They were volunteers. They were extensively trained. They had developed a culture of professional competence, of confidence in their ability to outsmart and outfight any opponent. And now, they were being slaughtered. The improved sonar was the primary cause. Destroyers equipped with Type 147 ASDIC could detect U-boats from miles away, track them through evasive maneuvers, and coordinate attacks with multiple ships. The hunting groups became ruthlessly efficient. A typical engagement would go like this. A convoy's escort group would include 6 to 8 destroyers, corvettes, and frigates. They'd steam in a defensive formation around the merchant ships, their sonar operators constantly sweeping the water ahead and to the sides. At 4,800 yards, nearly 3 miles, a destroyer would get a contact, a solid, strong return that indicated a submarine. The destroyer's captain would immediately signal the other escorts and break formation to investigate. At 4,000 yards, the sonar would confirm definite submarine contact. The destroyer would increase to flank speed, heading directly for the target. At 3,000 yards, other escorts would move in, forming a triangle around the projected location. Now the U-boat was surrounded by multiple sonar sources. Even if it evaded one destroyer, another would acquire contact. At 2,000 yards, the destroyers would launch their attack, but not the old way, not by steaming directly over the target and dropping a random pattern of charges. The new tactics were surgical. The leading destroyer would maintain sonar contact until the last possible moment, tracking the U-boat's exact course and speed. At 1,000 yards, It would mark the submarine's position with a smoke float, then veer off. A second destroyer, following behind, would use the smoke marker to position itself perfectly, then drop a pattern of charges calculated to bracket the submarine's projected location. Meanwhile, the first destroyer would circle back, reacquire contact, and prepare another attack. The second destroyer would do the same. This would continue for hours if necessary, with multiple destroyers taking turns, never letting the submarine rest, never letting it surface, never letting it escape. The U-boat would dive, twist, turn, try every evasion technique in the manual. But the 5,000-yard detection range meant the destroyers always knew where it was, and the Doppler tracking meant they knew where it was going. Most U-boats lasted less than an hour once this kind of coordinated attack began. Consider U-954, sunk on May 20, 1943. The boat was detected by HMS Jed at 4,600 yards while trying to approach convoy HX-239. U-954's commander immediately dove to maximum depth and began evasive maneuvers. Jed maintained contact and called in HMS Senon and HMS Loosestrife, 3 destroyers, 3 sonar sets, triangulating the U-boat's position from different angles. For 90 minutes, the destroyers took turns attacking. They dropped 64 depth charges. Every attack was within 100 yards of the submarine. Most were within 50 yards. At 1,542 hours, wreckage and oil bubbled to the surface. U-954 had imploded at depth. All 52 men aboard were killed instantly when the pressure hull failed. This wasn't unusual. This was the new normal. If you're finding this detailed history valuable, please consider subscribing. We put extensive research into every video. The German response was frantic but ineffective. Dönitz ordered all U-boats to dive immediately upon detecting any sonar pings, regardless of whether they believed the destroyer had seen them. Don't take chances. Don't try to identify the contact. Just dive and hope you can slip away. It didn't help. The 5,000-yard range meant that by the time a U-boat's hydrophone operator heard a ping, the destroyer had already been tracking them for several minutes. German engineers developed radar warning receivers to alert U-boats when they were being illuminated by British radar. The devices worked, but they only solved half the problem. They told you a destroyer was nearby, but they couldn't tell you if the destroyer had sonar contact on you or was just doing a routine sweep. U-boat commanders started ignoring the warnings because they went off constantly in the North Atlantic. Every time an Allied aircraft passed overhead, every time a convoy's radar swept past them, false alarms became routine, and genuine threats were missed in the noise. The Germans tried deploying Bold, a chemical decoy that, when released, created a cloud of bubbles that reflected sonar. It worked occasionally, but only if deployed before the destroyer was within 1,500 yards. By the time a U-boat knew it was being hunted, it was too late. The destroyer was already inside the decoy's effective range. They tried deeper diving. The Type 9 U-boats could reach 300 meters, but deeper diving meant slower speed, less maneuverability, and crushing water pressure that made every weld, every valve, every rivet a potential failure point. Boats were literally tearing apart under the stress. Nothing worked. By August of 1943, German U-boat losses exceeded replacement rates. The training schools couldn't produce experienced commanders fast enough. New captains were being sent into combat with only 6 months of training, compared to the 2 years of peacetime training that early commanders received. These inexperienced commanders made mistakes. They surfaced at the wrong time. They held their positions too long. They tried to fight on the surface instead of diving immediately. And they died. The casualty statistics became apocalyptic. Of the 1,150 U-boats commissioned during the war, 785 were sunk. That's a 68% loss rate for the submarines themselves, for the men who crewed them. 40,000 German submariners went to sea during World War II. 30,000 didn't come back. 75% casualties. Later in the war, particularly in the final year, that number approached 85%. Think about that. If you volunteered for U-boat duty in 1944, you had a 15% chance of surviving the war. 15%. Combat pilots had better odds. Infantry soldiers had better odds. Tank crews had better odds. U-boat service became the most dangerous assignment in the German military, and the men knew it. By late 1943, morale in the U-boat force was catastrophic. Crews went on patrol, knowing they probably wouldn't come back. Some boats had crews that were completely replaced 3 times over, as submarines were repeatedly sunk and survivors reassigned to new boats. The psychological toll was immense. Submariners developed a condition doctors called U-boat disease. Symptoms included anxiety, insomnia, constant nightmares, and psychological breaks during extended patrols. Men would become convinced the hull was about to implode. They'd hear phantom sounds of depth charges. Some became catatonic during attacks, unable to move or respond to orders. In one documented case from November 1943, a hydrophone operator on U-543 had a complete breakdown during a depth charge attack. He started screaming that he could hear water rushing in through the hull. There was no leak, the hull was intact, but the man was so convinced they were sinking that he tried to swim upward through the boat, clawing at bulkheads, trying to reach the surface hatch. He had to be sedated and restrained for the remainder of the patrol. These weren't weak men. These were volunteers who had passed rigorous psychological screening. But no amount of screening could prepare someone for the reality of being hunted by an enemy you couldn't see, couldn't fight, and as of 1943 couldn't escape. Let's return to Klaus Hartmann and U-91. After the March 19th attack, Hartmann managed to bring his damaged boat back to France. The repair crews at Lorient assessed the damage. Both periscopes destroyed, electrical systems damaged, pressure hull weakened by near-miss explosions. The boat would need 2 weeks of repairs. Hartmann's crew would get shore leave. During that shore leave, Hartmann met with other U-boat commanders. They compared notes, shared experiences. Every single commander reported the same thing. The British had a new weapon. Detection at extreme range, precision tracking. No escape. One commander, Hartmann's friend Peter Kremer of U-333, described an attack that lasted 11 hours. 11 hours of continuous depth charge attacks while 3 British destroyers took turns holding sonar contact. Kremer had tried every evasion technique. He'd dove to 280 meters, deeper than the boat was rated for. He'd used bold decoys. He'd even tried a technique called going dead in the water, shutting down all systems and letting the boat sit motionless on the ocean floor. Nothing worked. The British had maintained contact the entire time. The only reason Kremer survived was that the destroyers eventually ran out of depth charges and had to break off the attack. "It's not a fight anymore," Kremer told Hartmann over schnapps in a Lorient bar. "It's an execution. They hunt us like animals, and we can't even shoot back." Hartmann agreed. But what could they do? Refuse to sail? That was desertion, punishable by death. Transfer to another service? The Kriegsmarine didn't allow it. Once you were a submariner, you stayed a submariner until you were killed or the war ended. On April 4th, 1943, U-91 sailed on its next patrol. Hartmann knew the mission was likely suicide. His crew knew it too. Nobody said anything. They just went through the pre-departure procedures, cast off the moorings, and headed into the Atlantic. U-91 never returned. British records show the boat was sunk by HMS Hesperus on April 25th. Hesperus detected U-91 at 4,700 yards, tracked it through 40 minutes of evasive maneuvers, and delivered 4 precise depth charge attacks. The submarine imploded at 220 meters depth. Klaus Hartmann was 28 years old. He'd been married for 6 months. His wife received the standard telegram, "Your husband died a hero's death in defense of the fatherland." The telegram didn't mention that he'd spent his last moments in absolute darkness, in freezing water, being crushed by millions of tons of ocean pressure while his submarine collapsed around him. 44 men died with Hartmann. Not one body was recovered. The technological advantage that killed Hartmann and thousands like him wasn't just about detection range, it was about information dominance. Before the advanced sonar, both sides were operating in partial darkness. A U-boat didn't know where destroyers were until they were close. A destroyer didn't know where U-boats were until they were dangerously close. Combat was a close-range, chaotic affair, where luck mattered as much as skill. The 5,000-yard sonar changed that equation completely. Now destroyers knew where submarines were long before the submarines knew they'd been detected. That information asymmetry was lethal. A U-boat commander's decision-making process went from complex but manageable to essentially impossible. Should you dive when you hear a distant propeller sound? Maybe it's a merchant ship. Maybe it's a destroyer that hasn't seen you yet. If you dive and it's a merchant, you've wasted battery power and lost a potential target. If you don't dive and it's a destroyer, you're dead. The advanced sonar removed that ambiguity for the destroyer captains. They knew. They had precise range, bearing, and Doppler tracking. They could make informed decisions while U-boat commanders were still guessing. This is what modern military theorists call decision dominance. The side with better information makes better decisions faster, and in combat, better decisions compound. Each good decision gives you more options. Each bad decision eliminates options. Eventually, one side has all the options and the other side has none. By mid-1943, German U-boats had no options. They could dive and hope the destroyer passed them by, but the 5,000-yard range made that unlikely. They could run on the surface and try to outpace the destroyer, but U-boats were slower than destroyers. They could fight on the surface, but a submarine's deck gun against a destroyer's main battery was suicide. So they dove. And they died. The statistics tell the story more clearly than any narrative. In 1942, before the advanced sonar was widely deployed, it took an average of 250 depth charges to sink a U-boat. By late 1943, that number had dropped to an average of 64 charges. The efficiency increase was over 300%. Some sinkings required even fewer. U-175, sunk in April 1943 by USS Spencer, was destroyed with 36 depth charges, delivered in 3 patterns over 22 minutes. HMS Starling, commanded by Captain Frederick Walker, perfected a technique where multiple escorts would triangulate a U-boat's position and deliver simultaneous attacks from different angles, making evasion impossible. Using this method, Starling and her sister ships sank 6 U-boats in a single patrol, using an average of 42 charges per kill. The German naval staff analyzed these numbers and reached a conclusion that was both obvious and devastating. The U-boat campaign was no longer sustainable. In September 1943, Admiral Dönitz made a decision that effectively ended the Battle of the Atlantic. He withdrew most U-boats from the North Atlantic convoy routes and redeployed them to less heavily defended areas. The Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, the Arctic convoys to Russia. This wasn't a strategic repositioning. It was an admission of defeat. The North Atlantic routes were where the war would be won or lost. Cutting Britain's supply lines was the entire point of the U-boat campaign. By withdrawing, Dönitz was conceding that German submarines could no longer operate effectively in the primary theatre. The British didn't even have to declare victory. The Germans had declared their own defeat. But the story doesn't end there, because even after withdrawing from the North Atlantic, U-boats continued dying at catastrophic rates. The advanced sonar spread to every Allied navy. American destroyers got it. Canadian corvettes got it. Even the smaller submarine chasers and patrol craft got simplified versions. Everywhere German U-boats went, they encountered the same lethal precision, detection at miles range, tracking through evasive maneuvers, coordinated attacks that gave them no chance to escape. In the Mediterranean, where U-boats had operated with relative impunity in 1942, losses spiked to over 60% by late 1943. The confined waters made evasion even harder. There were no deep trenches to hide in, no thermal layers to duck under, just shallow water and multiple destroyers with overlapping sonar coverage. In the Indian Ocean, where Dönitz had hoped the vast distances would provide some safety, U-boats found that even merchant ships were now equipped with sonar, not the advanced 5,000-yard systems, but older models that were still effective at close range. U-boats that surfaced to attack merchants at night were being detected and evaded. By the time the submarine maneuvered into position for a torpedo shot, the merchant had called for help and destroyers were inbound. The Arctic convoys were the worst. The water was so cold that sonar worked even better. Sound travelled faster through the frigid water, with less distortion and interference. British destroyers, escorting convoys to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, achieved detection ranges of 5,400 yards, further than in any other theatre. U-boats sent to intercept these convoys had the lowest survival rates of the entire war. Of the 34 boats deployed to Arctic waters in late 1943-1944, 28 were sunk, 82% casualties. The men who crewed these submarines knew the odds. They weren't stupid, but they went anyway, because refusing meant facing a firing squad, and because some tiny part of them still believed they might be the lucky one, the one who made it back. Almost none of them did. By 1944, the German naval staff was assigning U-boats on what they internally called sacrifice patrols. They'd send a boat into an area where they needed intelligence like reconnaissance before an amphibious landing, knowing the boat would almost certainly be detected and sunk. The goal wasn't to have the submarine survive. The goal was to gather a few hours of radio reports before the boat was destroyed. This is what the U-boat force had been reduced to: manned reconnaissance drones, sent out to die so headquarters could update maps and estimates. The human cost was staggering. An entire generation of German submariners was, essentially, exterminated. Experienced commanders who'd survived the early years were killed. The new commanders replacing them lasted weeks, sometimes days. Training schools graduated classes of sailors knowing that 3/4 of them would be dead within 6 months. Families stopped receiving letters. Wives became widows. Children grew up never knowing their fathers. Small towns in Germany that had sent multiple men into the U-boat force found themselves with entire generations missing. And all of those deaths came down to physics and engineering. Sound waves travelling through water, transducer arrays measuring Doppler shifts, triangulation algorithms calculating precise positions. The men who died in U-boats weren't killed by enemy action in any traditional sense. They were killed by mathematics, by the simple fact that sound travels through water at a predictable speed, and modern electronics can measure that speed with enough precision to pinpoint their location. In the decades after the war, submariners from both sides occasionally met at reunions or conferences. The conversations were awkward but revealing. British destroyer captains would describe the hunt, how they'd track a contact for hours, how they'd coordinate with other ships, how methodical the attacks became. German survivors would describe the terror, the helplessness, the knowledge that somewhere above them, men were calmly plotting their deaths with instruments and calculations. Neither side felt particularly good about it. The British knew they'd been hunting men, not machines. The Germans knew they'd been sent on suicide missions by commanders who understood the technology had rendered U-boats obsolete, but kept sending them out anyway. One encounter stands out. In 1982, at a naval history conference in London, a British destroyer captain named David Williams met a German U-boat survivor named Wolfgang Hirschfeld. Hirschfeld had served on U-234 and U-109, both of which had been hunted by destroyers using advanced sonar. U-109 was sunk in May 1943. Hirschfeld survived only because he'd been transferred days before the boat's final patrol. Williams had commanded HMS Vanoc, which had participated in multiple U-boat kills using the Type 147 Azdic. The two men talked for hours. Hirschfeld described what it was like to hear the pings growing closer, knowing you couldn't escape. Williams described the strange disconnect of hunting men he couldn't see, tracking contacts on a screen, making calculations, dropping charges, and seeing oil slicks that represented dozens of deaths. At one point, Williams asked Hirschfeld if he'd ever hated the destroyer crews who hunted him. Hirschfeld thought for a long time before answering. "No," he finally said. "You were doing your job. We were doing ours. You just had better tools." That might be the most concise summary of the entire story. The Germans were brave. The British were brave. The difference wasn't courage or skill or determination. The difference was technology. 5,000 yards of sonar detection range versus 1,500. Doppler tracking versus educated guessing. Coordinated attacks versus random depth charge patterns. That technological edge killed 40,000 German submariners, not because they were cowards, not because they didn't fight hard enough, but because they were fighting a battle that couldn't be won with tactics or bravery. You can't outmaneuver mathematics. You can't outthink physics. When one side can see 3 miles and the other side can see half a mile, the outcome is predetermined. The legacy of this technological revolution extends far beyond World War II. Modern submarines are designed with the understanding that acoustic detection is the primary threat. Every aspect of submarine design, hull shape, propeller design, machinery mounting, even the paint used on the exterior, is optimized to reduce acoustic signature. Modern destroyers and submarines use sonar systems that make the 1943 Type 147 look like a child's toy. Detection ranges measured in tens of miles. Computer processing that can distinguish a submarine from background noise even when the submarine is trying to hide. Towed arrays that can be deployed behind a ship, listening passively for the slightest sound. The cat-and-mouse game between submarines and surface ships continues, but it's still a game defined by the same basic principle established in 1943. The side with better detection capabilities controls the engagement. That's why modern navies invest billions in both improving their sonar systems and reducing their submarines' acoustic signatures. The same calculation that doomed German U-boats still applies. If you can be detected at 5,000 yards and your enemy can only detect you at 1,500, you win. If the situation is reversed, you lose. It's that simple. And that brutal. Today, there are no surviving U-boat veterans. The last of them died in the 2010s. With them went the living memory of what it was like to be hunted by technology you couldn't counter, couldn't see, couldn't escape. But the statistics remain, the records remain, the stories remain. And they tell us something important about modern warfare. Technology matters more than courage. Information dominance matters more than tactics. And when your enemy achieves a fundamental breakthrough, whether it's radar or nuclear weapons or advanced sonar, no amount of bravery or determination can overcome that disadvantage. The German submariners were among the most dedicated, skilled, and courageous fighting men of World War II. They volunteered for the most dangerous duty. They trained obsessively. They developed sophisticated tactics. And 30,000 of them died because the British figured out how to make sound waves travel through water more effectively. That's the lesson. That's what the numbers mean. That's why the casualty rate hit 85%, not because German submariners lacked courage, but because they were fighting physics itself. And physics always wins. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. At 05:30 hours on August 17, 1943, Technical Sergeant Robert Dutch Keller stood beside a B-17F Flying Fortress at Framlingham Airfield in Suffolk, England, watching 40 gallons of aviation fuel drain into a steel drum. The fuel wasn't going back into the bomber. It was going into a separate container that Keller had hidden behind the maintenance hangar for the past 2 weeks. The fuel was stolen, and in 6 hours, it was going to save 30 lives. The B-17 beside him was tail number 4230196, nicknamed Nip and Tuck. It belonged to the 394th Bomb Group, part of the 4th Bombardment Wing. In 3 hours, this aircraft and 145 others would take off on the longest, most dangerous mission the 8th Air Force had ever attempted. Target: the Messerschmitt Aircraft Factory at Regensburg, 430 miles inside occupied Europe. After bombing, they wouldn't return to England. They'd continue south over the Alps, across the Mediterranean, and land at airfields in Algeria. Total distance: over 1,500 miles. No B-17 had ever flown that far in combat. The problem was fuel. More specifically, The problem was that regulation 100-octane aviation gasoline would not get them there. Keller had done the math 17 times. He'd calculated fuel consumption rates, cruise speeds, combat power settings, and formation flying inefficiencies. Every calculation arrived at the same conclusion. At least 30 aircraft would run out of fuel over the Mediterranean Sea or the North African desert. The crews would die. Not from German fighters, not from flak, from empty fuel tanks. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Keller had been a mechanic with the 394th since April. Before that, he'd worked for Standard Oil in Bayonne, New Jersey. He understood petroleum chemistry better than most engineers. He knew that aviation fuel wasn't a single substance. It was a carefully blended mixture of hydrocarbons with specific additives. Tetraethyl lead to prevent engine knock, aromatic compounds to boost octane rating, stabilizers to prevent gum formation. The standard fuel issued to bomber units was rated 100 octane for lean mixture, 130 octane for rich mixture. It was good fuel, but it wasn't optimal for extreme range missions. The Wright Cyclone R 18-20-97 engines on the B-17F were designed for high-altitude performance, not fuel efficiency. At 25,000 feet, each engine consumed approximately 50 gallons per hour at cruise power. 4 engines, 50 gallons each, 200 gallons total per hour. With Tokyo tanks installed, a B-17F carried 36 30 gallons maximum. That gave roughly 18 hours of flight time under ideal conditions. But combat wasn't ideal. Formation flying increased fuel consumption by 15%. Evasive maneuvers burned even more. And nobody knew how long the Regensburg force would circle over North Africa waiting for landing clearance. Keller had access to something the official fuel supply system didn't provide: 131 octane fuel. It came from a batch intended for P-47 Thunderbolt fighters. The higher octane rating allowed for leaner cruise mixtures without detonation, which reduced fuel consumption by approximately 8%. 8% didn't sound like much, but on a 1,500-mile mission, 8% was the difference between landing in Algeria and ditching in the sea. The problem was regulations. Bomber crews were specifically prohibited from using fighter-grade fuel. The reasoning was sound. Fighter fuel cost more to produce, was in shorter supply, and contained additives that could cause long-term deposits in engines designed for standard aviation, gasoline. Using it required authorization from Wright Field Engineering Command in Ohio, and Wright Field was 4,000 miles away. Keller had submitted a formal request on August 1st. He'd explained the fuel consumption problem. He'd shown his calculations. He'd detailed how 30 bombers, approximately 300 men, might not make it to Algeria on standard fuel. The response came back 8 days later. Request denied. Use of non-standard fuel grades requires extensive engine testing. Maintain current fuel protocols. So, Keller stole the fuel. Not all at once. Small quantities, 40 to 60 gallons at a time, drained from fighter aircraft that came through for maintenance. He stored it in drums behind the hangar, covered with canvas tarps, marked as contaminated fuel pending disposal. Nobody questioned it. Contaminated fuel was common. Water in the tanks, sediment, rust. Mechanics dealt with it constantly. By August 15th, Keller had accumulated 480 gallons of 100 to 31 octane fuel. Not enough to fill 30 B-17 seconds, but enough to make a difference. His plan was simple: blend the high-octane fuel with standard fuel in a ratio that would boost the effective octane rating without causing engine problems. The blend would go into specific aircraft with the longest flight times, the ones most likely to run out of fuel. The chemistry was straightforward. Mix 1 part 131 octane fuel with 3 parts 100 octane fuel. The result: approximately 108 octane effective rating, high enough to allow leaner cruise mixtures, low enough to avoid detonation problems. But mixing fuel wasn't like mixing paint. Aviation fuel had to meet precise specifications: vapor pressure, freezing point, aromatic content. Get it wrong, and engines would fail. possibly catastrophically. Keller tested the blend on August 14th. He mixed 60 gallons in a drum, ran it through a makeshift filtration system, tested the specific gravity with a hydrometer. The numbers looked right, but numbers on paper weren't the same as an engine running at 25,000 feet with the temperature at -50 degrees Fahrenheit. He needed to flight test it. At midnight on August 15th, he approached Lieutenant James O'Brien, pilot of Hell's Kitchen, a B-17F from the 545th Squadron. Keller and O'Brien had history. O'Brien's aircraft had taken flak damage over Bremen in July. The number 3 engine had seized. Keller had worked 16 straight hours replacing it, got the aircraft flight ready in time for the next mission. O'Brien remembered. Keller explained the situation. The fuel shortage, the Regensburg mission, the unauthorized blend. O'Brien listened without interrupting. When Keller finished, O'Brien asked one question. "Will it get us to Africa?" Keller said he thought so. O'Brien said, "Then do it." On August 16th, O'Brien flew a test mission, not combat mission, a navigation training flight over the North Sea. The fuel load was 50-50, half standard fuel, half Keller's blend, 4 hours, at various power settings and altitudes. When O'Brien landed, he reported no engine abnormalities. Fuel consumption was 7.3% lower than standard calculations predicted. The blend worked. Keller made his decision. He would fuel 30 aircraft from the 394th and 395th bomb groups with his blend. Not the entire fuel load. That would be too obvious. He'd top off the Tokyo tanks with the blend after the official fueling was complete. The Tokyo tanks held 1080 gallons. With 480 gallons of high-octane fuel, he could give each of 30 aircraft approximately 16 gallons of pure 131 octane, which, when mixed with the standard fuel already in the tanks, would raise the effective octane just enough. The night of August 16th, Keller and 3 other mechanics he'd brought into the plan began the work. They moved between aircraft in the darkness, connecting hoses, pumping fuel. Each aircraft took about 12 minutes. They worked in silence, no flashlights, feeling their way by touch and memory. By 0300 hours on August 17th, 30 B-17 seconds carried Keller's fuel. The mechanics left no documentation, no fuel logs, no maintenance entries. If the mission succeeded, nobody would ask questions. If it failed, they'd all face court-martial. At 0600 hours, the crews began their pre-flight briefings. The mission details shocked everyone. Regensburg wasn't just deep, it was suicidal. 430 miles into Germany without fighter escort for most of the route. Then another 900 miles over the Alps and Mediterranean to North Africa. Flying time, approximately 9 hours. The planners called it a shuttle mission, as if giving it a name made it less insane. The weather over England was terrible. Ground fog, drizzle, visibility less than a quarter mile. The original plan called for simultaneous takeoff, with another force attacking Schweinfurt. The two forces would split German fighter defences, but the Schweinfurt force remained grounded, waiting for the fog to lift. The Regensburg force couldn't wait. If they delayed, they'd arrive over North Africa after dark with no navigation aids. Colonel Curtis LeMay, commander of the 4th Bombardment Wing, made the call. They'd go alone. At 0721, the first B-17 climbed into the murk. Instrument takeoff, through 2 layers of overcast, crews praying they wouldn't collide during formation assembly. Keller watched from the ground as aircraft after aircraft disappeared into the grey ceiling. Nip and Tuck took off at 0738. Hell's Kitchen, at 0742, 30 modified aircraft spread across 4 squadrons. The formation assembled over East Anglia at 15,000 feet, 146 bombers in combat boxes, each box a tight formation designed for mutual defensive fire. At 0800 hours, they turned east toward the North Sea. 87 P-47 Thunderbolts fell in as escort. The fighters could only stay until the German border. After that, the bombers would be alone. What Keller didn't know, what nobody knew yet, was that the Germans were waiting. Luftwaffe radar had tracked the formation from takeoff. Fighter controllers scrambled every available aircraft across western Germany. 300 Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190 fighters, the largest defensive fighter force Germany had ever assembled. The bombers crossed the Dutch coast at 09:15. The P-47s turned back 15 minutes later, low on fuel. The first German fighters appeared at 09:45. A dozen Bf-109s diving from altitude, head-on attacks, 20mm cannons firing. The combat boxes tightened. 50 caliber machine guns hammered. The sky filled with tracers and smoke. For the next 90 minutes, the bomber force fought its way across Germany. Continuous attacks, waves of fighters hitting from every angle. Aircraft fell, some exploded, some spun down trailing fire, parachutes blossomed. By the time the formation reached Regensburg at 11:43, 15 B-17 seconds were gone. 13 more were heavily damaged. The bombing run was textbook, clear visibility, minimal flak. The Norden bomb sites locked onto the factory complex. At 11:43, 126 bombers released 298.75 tons of bombs, high explosives and incendiaries. The factory disappeared in smoke and flame. Every major building hit. But there was no time to assess damage. More fighters were coming. The formation turned south, toward Austria and the Alps. German fighters pursued but broke off after 20 minutes, low on fuel and ammunition. The bombers climbed to clear the mountains. 19,000 feet over the Brenner Pass, temperature -42 degrees Fahrenheit. Crews on oxygen, electrically heated suits, struggling against the cold. By 1300 hours, the formation was over northern Italy, descending toward the Mediterranean. This was the critical phase. Fuel consumption calculations had always been theoretical. Now they became real. Pilots checked their gauges. Some showed comfortable margins, others were dropping faster than predicted. Several aircraft began to lag behind the formation, unable to maintain speed, conserving fuel. At 13:45, the first aircraft ditched. Dangerous Deb, a B-17F from the 385th Bomb Group, ran out of fuel 50 miles off the Italian coast. The crew sent a mayday, deployed life rafts, went down in the sea. Rescue would take hours, if it came at all. 20 minutes later, 2 more aircraft ditched, both from squadrons that hadn't received Keller's fuel, blend. By 14:30 hours, 5 bombers were down in the Mediterranean. The survivors pressed on, engines running on fumes, pilots nursing every gallon. The aircraft with Keller's blend flew differently. The pilots noticed it without understanding why. Fuel gauges dropped more slowly than expected. Engines ran smoothly at leaner mixture settings that normally would have caused rough running. On Hell's Kitchen, Lieutenant O'Brien watched his fuel totalizer and realized they were going to make it. Barely, but they'd make it. At 1500 hours, the formation crossed the North African coast. Airfields at Telagma, Bertaux, and Beaune appeared ahead. Aircraft peeled off, individual bombers heading for the nearest runway. Some landed with less than 50 gallons remaining. Others touched down with tanks reading empty, running on fumes in the fuel lines. Hell's Kitchen landed at Telagma at 15:18 hours. When the engines shut down, O'Brien checked the fuel gauges. 73 gallons remaining. According to standard calculations, they should have been bone dry over the Mediterranean. The extra fuel had saved them. Across the 3 airfields, ground crews swarmed the arriving bombers. Fuel trucks rolled. Damage assessment teams counted bullet holes. 30 aircraft were mission-capable with repairs. 16 needed major work. The rest were written off. Of the 146 B-17 seconds that took off from England, 24 never made it to Africa. 10 shot down over Germany. 5 ditched in the Mediterranean. 4 landed in neutral Switzerland. 5 crashed attempting emergency landings at Italian airfields. But 122 survived. And of the 30 aircraft that carried Keller's fuel blend, 29 made it to Africa. Only 1 had ditched, and that was due to battle damage, not fuel starvation. The numbers were striking, but nobody was looking at them yet. In the chaos of arrival, sorting aircraft, treating wounded, accounting for missing crews. Nobody noticed the pattern. Keller learned about the mission results 3 days later. The intelligence summary came through channels, detailed losses, noted fuel problems, mentioned that several aircraft had ditched due to fuel exhaustion, while others landed with surprising reserves. The report didn't explain why some aircraft had more fuel than others, but Keller knew. He also knew he'd committed a court-martial offense, unauthorized fuel modification, theft of military property, violation of engine operating protocols. If anyone investigated, he was finished. But investigating meant admitting that standard fuel loads were inadequate for the mission. It meant admitting that planners had sent crews out with insufficient margins. It meant asking uncomfortable questions about why a mechanic with a stolen fuel blend had saved lives that regulation procedures couldn't save. So nobody investigated. The mission was declared a success. The factory at Regensburg was severely damaged. The cost was acceptable by strategic bombing standards. The fuel issues were noted as lessons learned for future planning, and Keller's 30 aircraft, with their unauthorized fuel, disappeared into the statistics. Except Lieutenant O'Brien remembered. And O'Brien talked to other pilots in his squadron, and those pilots talked to their crew chiefs, and within 2 weeks, 5 other mechanics were asking Keller about his fuel blend, quietly, unofficially. Just in case another long-range mission came up, the second Schweinfurt raid came on October 14, 1943. 291 B-17 seconds attacked the ball-bearing factories deep in Germany. No shuttle mission this time. They'd bomb and return to England. But the distance was nearly as far as Regensburg, and fuel would again be critical. Keller and his network of mechanics prepared 58 aircraft with the blend. Not officially, not with authorization. They worked at night, moved fuel in, unmarked drums, kept no records. The mission was a disaster. 60 bombers lost, 20% of the force. But every aircraft with Keller's blend that survived the German fighters made it back to England. The ones running standard fuel weren't so lucky. 4 ran out of fuel over the English Channel. 3 crash-landed in France with empty tanks. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. After Schweinfurt, the deep penetration missions stopped. The losses were unsustainable. The 8th Air Force needed long-range fighters before it could return to Germany. The P-51 Mustang would solve that problem eventually. But fuel would remain a concern throughout the war. Range, consumption, octane ratings. The margins were always tight. Keller's fuel blend never became official. No engineering report, no field modification order. It existed in the grey zone, between regulation and necessity, between what the manual said and what actually worked. Other mechanics adopted it, modified it, experimented with ratios. By mid-1944, at least 6 different bomber groups were using locally blended fuel for maximum range missions. The practice was known but not acknowledged. As long as engines didn't fail and aircraft returned, nobody asked questions. Robert Keller survived the war. He returned to Standard Oil in 1945, worked as a refinery supervisor, retired in 1972. He never spoke publicly about the fuel blend. When asked about his service, he'd say he kept airplanes flying, which was true. He just didn't mention how. Lieutenant James O'Brien flew 34 combat missions, survived them all, returned to Oklahoma in 1944. He kept in touch with Keller for 40 years. Every year, on August 17th, O'Brien would call Keller and say the same thing. "Thanks for the gas, Dutch." And Keller would respond, "You would have made it anyway." Both of them knew that wasn't true. The Regensburg mission remains one of the most controversial operations in 8th Air Force history. The planning was flawed. The fuel margins were inadequate. The losses were severe. But it demonstrated something important. American forces could strike anywhere in occupied Europe. The psychological impact on Germany was significant. If the Americans could hit Regensburg, nowhere was safe. What the mission also demonstrated, though this was never officially acknowledged, was that regulations written in offices couldn't always account for combat reality. Engineers at Wright Field designed fuel specifications for normal operations. They didn't account for 9-hour missions with continuous fighter attacks and formation flying at high altitude. The mechanics who actually maintained the aircraft, who actually understood fuel consumption under real combat conditions, knew better. The tension between official procedures and practical necessity defined much of the ground war in maintenance. Crew chiefs regularly modified aircraft in ways that violated technical orders. Armourers jury-rigged gun mounts. Radio operators bypassed official communications procedures. Everyone bent rules when lives were at stake. Most of these modifications were never documented. They existed as tribal knowledge, passed mechanic to mechanic, squadron to squadron. Keller's fuel blend was one of dozens, maybe hundreds, of unauthorized modifications that kept the 8th Air Force flying. Some were brilliant innovations, some were desperate expedients. All shared one characteristic: they worked better than the official solution. And because they worked, they were tolerated, quietly, unofficially, as long as nobody made too much noise about them. The deeper truth was that the Air Force command structure didn't want to know. Acknowledging unauthorized modifications meant admitting that official procedures were inadequate. It meant opening investigations that would reveal uncomfortable facts about mission planning and aircraft limitations. It was easier to look the other way, to let mechanics do what they needed to do, and to focus on mission results rather than methods. This created a strange duality. On paper, everything followed regulations. Maintenance logs showed standard procedures. Fuel records indicated regulation-grade gasoline. Inspection reports certified compliance with technical orders. But on the flight line, reality was different. Mechanics used non-standard parts, blended fuels, modified systems. Pilots learned which aircraft had which unofficial upgrades and requested those planes for difficult missions. The system worked because everyone involved understood the unspoken agreement. Don't put it in writing. Don't make it official. Don't force anyone to make a decision that might have to be defended later. Just do what needs doing and let the results speak for themselves. Keller's legacy wasn't his fuel blend. Dozens of engineers could have developed better formulations with proper time and resources. His legacy was the demonstration that ground-level innovation could solve problems that command-level planning missed. He saw a problem, calculated a solution, took personal risk to implement it, and saved lives. That pattern repeated across every theatre of the war, in every service branch, wherever practical people encountered impractical regulations. The question his actions raised was never answered. Should military organizations prioritize strict adherence to procedures, or should they encourage field innovation when regulations prove inadequate? The answer matters because wars aren't won by following rules. They're won by adapting faster than the enemy. And adaptation often means breaking rules that no longer serve their purpose. In Keller's case, the rule he broke was designed to prevent engine damage from incompatible fuels. The concern was legitimate. Using wrong fuel, grades could destroy engines worth thousands of dollars. But the rule assumed normal operations. It didn't account for missions where fuel exhaustion meant ditching in the ocean with a 90% fatality rate. When the cost of following rules exceeded the cost of breaking them, Keller chose survival over compliance. No investigation ever discovered his actions. The blended fuel looked identical to standard fuel. It smelled the same, had the same color, passed basic field tests. Without sophisticated laboratory analysis, it was indistinguishable. And nobody with authority to order such analysis wanted to find anything that would complicate the narrative of mission success. So the truth stayed hidden. 30 aircraft with unauthorized fuel, 29 successful arrivals in Africa, a mechanic who stole fighter fuel to blend a better mixture, and 300 men who lived because someone broke regulations at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right way. Years later, when aviation historians studied the Schweinfurt-Regensburg missions, they noted the fuel problems. They documented aircraft that ditched due to fuel starvation. They calculated theoretical fuel consumption and noticed discrepancies with actual results. Some researchers noted that certain squadrons had better fuel performance than others, but attributed it to better pilot technique or aircraft condition. Nobody discovered the blend. The evidence was consumed in engine fires and Mediterranean waves. The drums behind the hangar were emptied and returned to supply. The mechanics who helped Keller never spoke about it, not even after the war. Some secrets stay secret not because they're protected, but because nobody's looking for them. Robert Dutch Keller died in 1996 at age 78. His obituary mentioned his wartime service as an aircraft mechanic with the 394th Bomb Group. It did not mention the fuel blend. It did not mention the night of August 16, 43, when he topped off 30 fuel tanks with an unauthorized mixture. It did not mention that he broke regulations to save lives. In his garage in Bayonne, New Jersey, there's a metal toolbox with his name stenciled on the side. Inside that toolbox, among the wrenches and pliers and measuring tools, there's a small notebook. On one page, dated August 15, 1943, there's a chemical formula, ratios, octane ratings, specific gravity measurements. The calculations that determined how to blend two types of aviation fuel to extract 8% better fuel efficiency. Nobody has opened that notebook since Keller died. His children kept it as a memento. They don't know what the numbers mean. To them, it's just another artifact from a father who worked with aircraft. They don't know it represents 30 crews, 300 men, who made it to North Africa on fuel that regulations said they couldn't use. The B-17 Flying Fortress, nip and tuck, tail number 4230196, completed its mission to Africa, returned to England 3 days later, and flew 47 more combat missions before being retired in June 1944. It was scrapped in December of that year. No record mentions that on one mission, in August 1943, it flew on fuel blended by a mechanic who wasn't supposed to do that. Hell's Kitchen, Lieutenant O'Brien's aircraft, flew 62 missions, survived the war, returned to the United States in November 1945. It was eventually sold for scrap in Arizona. O'Brien kept a piece of the cockpit throttle quadrant. On it, he'd scratched 4 words. Dutch's gas got us home. The lesson of Keller's fuel blend isn't about chemistry. It's about the gap between what systems plan for and what reality demands. Every complex organization faces this gap. Procedures are written based on expected conditions. But conditions change. Missions get harder. Requirements get tighter. Margins disappear. And when that happens, somebody has to make a choice, follow the rules and accept the consequences, or break the rules and risk punishment for doing what actually needs doing. Keller chose the second option. He accepted personal risk to give crews a better chance. He stole fuel, violated engine operating procedures, falsified maintenance records, and endangered his career. And in doing so, he saved lives that regulations couldn't save. The irony is that his solution wasn't particularly innovative. Any competent fuel chemist could have developed the blend. The innovation was the willingness to implement it without authorization. That willingness defined the difference between theoretical solutions and actual solutions. Theory requires approval. Reality requires action. The larger question remains, how many other mechanics made similar choices? How many unauthorized modifications kept aircraft flying? How many field expedients solved problems that official channels couldn't address? The answer is unknowable because successful unauthorized actions leave no traces. They disappear into mission statistics as unexplained variances, slightly better performance, marginally higher survival rates. But they mattered. In aggregate, across thousands of aircraft and hundreds of missions, those small unauthorized improvements added up. They represented the difference between a force that followed procedures and lost, and a force that adapted and won. Robert Keller never received recognition for his fuel blend. He never sought it. To him, it was just part of the job. Keep the aircraft flying, keep the crews alive, do what needs doing. Everything else was paperwork. The story of Dutch Keller's fuel blend raises a question that military historians have debated for decades. What role did unauthorized innovation play in Allied victory? The official histories focus on strategy, logistics, industrial production. They document approved modifications, sanctioned, changes, official improvements. But wars aren't won only by what appears in reports. They're won by sergeants who ignore regulations, mechanics who bend rules, pilots who trust their crews more than their manuals. Keller wasn't unique. He was part of a shadow network of problem solvers who operated outside official channels because official channels moved too slowly. In the 8th Air Force alone, dozens of mechanics were running similar experiments, mixing oil additives to reduce engine wear at high altitude, adjusting turbocharger wastegate settings beyond specifications to gain a few hundred feet of ceiling, rewiring electrical systems to prevent failures that killed crews when guns froze. None of this appeared in maintenance logs. Technical inspectors would find aircraft in perfect compliance during formal reviews. But after the inspector left, crew chiefs would reinstall their modifications. Pilots knew which aircraft had which upgrades. They'd request specific tail numbers for difficult missions. The squadron operations officer would approve the requests without asking why. Everyone understood the game. The culture of unauthorized modification existed because the official procurement and approval system couldn't keep pace with combat evolution. When the 8th Air Force began operations in 1942, German fighters attacked from behind and below. By mid-1943, they'd switched to head-on attacks. The solution was obvious: add forward-firing guns to the B-17's nose. But getting approval for design changes, manufacturing new parts, installing them in existing aircraft, took months. Mechanics couldn't wait months. They improvised gun mounts from scrap metal, installed additional machine guns in positions that weren't designed for them, jury-rigged ammunition feeds. The results were crude but effective. When Boeing finally released the B-17G with its factory-installed chin turret in September 1943, it incorporated many features that mechanics had already invented in the field. The official modification validated what ground crews already knew. Sometimes the best solutions come from the people actually working the problem. Keller's fuel blend followed this pattern. He identified a problem that official channels hadn't addressed. He developed a solution using available resources. He tested it carefully. He implemented it, knowing the personal risk. And he succeeded where regulation procedures would have failed. The risk was real. If even one engine had failed due to the modified fuel, the entire operation would have been exposed. Keller would face court-martial. The other mechanics involved would be charged as accomplices. The pilots who knew about it might face discipline for accepting unauthorized modifications. Careers would end, reputations would be destroyed, and the 8th Air Force would issue directives making it clear that unauthorized fuel modifications were absolutely forbidden under any circumstances. But Keller had calculated not just the chemistry, but the politics. He knew that if the blend worked, nobody would investigate. Success erases questions. Only failures get examined. His gamble was that 30 aircraft would perform better than expected, and in the chaos of mission results, nobody would ask why. He was right. The post-mission analysis focused on losses, battle damage, bombing accuracy. Fuel consumption was noted as within expected parameters with some variation. The variation was attributed to differences in pilot technique, aircraft weight, formation position. Nobody dug deeper. The fuel system officer filed his report, noted that future long-range missions should plan for higher fuel consumption, and moved on to the next problem. What Keller couldn't know at the time was how close his calculations had been to disaster. The fuel blend worked, but barely. The tolerance margin was approximately 3%. If he'd mixed the ratios slightly wrong, if the octane rating had been 2 points lower, if the engine operating temperatures had been 50 degrees different, the results could have been catastrophic. Several engines might have detonated under high power settings, aircraft might have crashed on takeoff, the entire mission could have been aborted due to mechanical failures. The difference between success and failure was Keller's expertise. He understood fuel chemistry at a level that most mechanics didn't. His years at Standard Oil had taught him how different hydrocarbons behaved under varying temperature and pressure conditions. He knew that aviation fuel wasn't just about octane rating, it was about vapor pressure, freezing point, aromatic content, lead concentration. Change one parameter and you affected others. The blend had to be balanced across multiple characteristics. He'd done the calculations on scraps of paper, sitting in the barracks at night, using slide rules and reference tables he'd kept from his refinery days. The other mechanics watched him work and didn't fully understand what he was doing. They trusted his expertise because they'd seen his results. When Keller said an engine would last another 50 hours, it lasted another 50 hours. When he said a fuel pump was failing, it failed within a week. He had credibility. That credibility was essential because the fuel blend required trust. The pilots who flew with Keller's fuel were trusting him with their lives. They couldn't verify his calculations. They couldn't test the fuel independently. They had to believe that this mechanic, who was violating regulations and risking court-martial, knew what he was doing better than the engineers at Wright Field who wrote the specifications. Lieutenant O'Brien had made that calculation explicitly. When Keller explained the fuel blend, O'Brien asked the right question, not whether it was approved, but whether it would work. O'Brien understood that approval meant nothing at 25,000 feet, over the Mediterranean. Only results mattered. He bet his life and his crew's lives on Keller's judgment. And Keller delivered. But O'Brien wasn't gambling blindly. He'd watched Keller work for months. He'd seen how Keller approached problems, how he tested solutions, how he double-checked his work. O'Brien knew that Keller wasn't a cowboy taking reckless chances. He was a professional, solving a problem that official channels couldn't address in time. This relationship between pilots and mechanics was fundamental to how the 8th Air Force functioned. The official chain of command flowed through officers and formal procedures, but the actual operation of combat aircraft depended on trust relationships between pilots and their crew chiefs. Pilots needed to know their aircraft were properly maintained. Crew chiefs needed pilots who would report problems honestly and fly aircraft the way they were designed to be flown. When that trust existed, both sides could take risks that regulations prohibited. Keller built that trust through competence and consistency. His aircraft had the lowest mechanical abort rate in the squadron. His engines ran smoothly. His electrical systems didn't fail. When he said an aircraft was ready to fly, it was ready to fly. So when he said he had a fuel blend that would extend range, pilots believed him. The trust network extended beyond individual pilot-mechanic relationships. By August 1943, the mechanics in the 394th Bomb Group functioned as a semi-autonomous unit within the official command structure. They coordinated among themselves, shared solutions, covered for each other. When one crew chief needed a non-standard part, others would scrounge it from damaged aircraft or borrow it from other squadrons. When an aircraft needed work that violated technical orders, they'd do it at night and forge the inspection paperwork. The officers knew this was happening. The squadron engineering officer wasn't stupid. He could see that aircraft were performing better than specifications predicted. He noticed that mechanical failure rates were lower than official statistics suggested they should be. But he also knew that investigating would create problems he didn't want to deal with, so he maintained plausible deniability. As long as the aircraft kept flying and the mission success rate remained high, he didn't ask questions. This unofficial tolerance created space for innovation. Keller and mechanics like him could experiment, test solutions, implement improvements without bureaucratic interference. The cost was personal risk. If anything went wrong, they'd face punishment. But the benefit was the ability to solve real problems in real time, rather than waiting for official channels to maybe, eventually, authorize changes. The fuel blend was Keller's most significant innovation, but not his only one. Over his 2 years with the 394th, he developed dozens of small improvements. A modification to oil cooler baffles that reduced engine temperatures by 8 degrees. A rewiring of the oxygen system that reduced failures by 30%. A bracket design that prevented machine gun feed systems from jamming at high altitude. None of these modifications appeared in official records. All of them saved lives. Other mechanics developed their own innovations. Sergeant Mike Russo at the 395th figured out how to modify turbocharger regulators to give engines an extra 200 horsepower at altitude without damaging them. Sergeant Tom Chen at the 91st developed a fuel tank sealing compound that was more effective than the official sealant. Sergeant Bill Morrison at the 306th created an electrical heating system for gun positions that actually worked, unlike the standard system that failed constantly. These innovations spread through informal networks. Mechanics talked to each other at the enlisted mess, shared drawings on napkins, demonstrated techniques in the maintenance hangars. Good ideas propagated quickly. Bad ideas were identified and abandoned before they caused problems. The system was self-correcting because the mechanics who implemented modifications bore the consequences if they failed. This informal innovation network was one of the significant advantages Allied forces had over German forces. The Luftwaffe maintenance system was more rigid, more hierarchical, more dependent on official approval. German mechanics who identified problems had to submit reports through channels and wait for engineering command to authorize solutions. This made sense for an air force designed to fight short campaigns with clear supply lines. It made less sense for sustained combat operations where conditions changed constantly. The American approach was messier, but more adaptive. Mechanics had more autonomy, more access to resources, more tolerance for improvisation. This created waste and inefficiency in some areas. But it also created innovation and adaptation that formal systems couldn't match. Keller's fuel blend was a perfect example. A field mechanic solved a problem in 2 weeks that would have taken official channels 6 months to address, if they addressed it at all. The irony was that after the war, when the Air Force studied what made the 8th Air Force successful, they focused on strategic bombing doctrine, formation tactics, fighter escort development. The role of unauthorized field modifications barely appeared in official histories. The mechanics who made those modifications weren't interviewed. Their innovations weren't documented. The institutional knowledge that made combat operations possible was lost as the mechanics returned to civilian life. Keller went back to Standard Oil and never spoke publicly about his wartime work. When asked, he'd say he was a mechanic in England. If pressed, he'd mention that he worked on B-17 seconds. He wouldn't discuss the fuel blend, the unauthorized modifications, the rules he broke. To him, it wasn't worth discussing. It was just the job. You saw a problem. You fixed it. Everything else was unnecessary complication. That attitude was typical of his generation. They did extraordinary things and considered them ordinary. They took personal risks and dismissed them as nothing special. They saved lives and shrugged it off as just doing what needed doing. The contrast with modern military culture is striking. Today's forces document everything, seek recognition for achievements, emphasize individual contributions. Keller's generation did the opposite. They kept quiet, avoided attention, disappeared into anonymity. But their contributions matter historically because they reveal how organizations actually function under pressure. The official structure provides framework and resources. The unofficial network provides adaptation and innovation. Both are necessary. Neither is sufficient alone. Understanding this duality is essential to understanding how the 8th Air Force and military forces generally achieve success despite chaos, uncertainty, and imperfect information. Robert Keller's fuel blend saved 30 crews on August 17, 1943. It probably saved others on subsequent missions. The total number of lives preserved by his unauthorized innovation will never be known precisely. But the fact that the number exists, that real people lived because one mechanic decided regulations were less important than results, that fact tells us something important about how wars are actually won. Not by following rules, by knowing when to break them. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.